This episode is brought to you by Michelob Ultra. Michelob Ultra is perfect for more than just the summer heat this year, because not only is it refreshing and crisp with only 95 calories, but Ultra is also the official beer sponsor of Team USA at the Olympic Games Paris 2024. Celebrate every point, race, and moment with Team USA and Michelob Ultra for the Olympic Games Paris 2024. Stock up on Michelob Ultra and cheer on Team USA. Enjoy responsibly. Copyright 2024 Anheuser-Busch Michelob Ultra Light Beer, St. Louis, Missouri.
I'm Jason Pack.
And I'm Alex Hall, and this is Disorder,
a show where we love taking questions from our mega ordering listeners because sometimes they know how to order the disorder even better than we do.
Jason, I'm going to kick off with two questions to you. And I suggest we take these two together because they both relate to the role of the International Criminal Court and the International Court of Justice. Two very distinct bodies that are a little bit like the European Court of Justice and the European Court of Human Rights often get conflated by people, and they are two very different bodies. But we have two listeners' questions that I think are more directed towards you. The first comes from Kristen, who writes, in a recent episode, Jason referred to the International Criminal Court with apparent disdain. I have listened to numerous episodes, but none, to my knowledge, are focused on these current set of institutions and organizations that we rely upon to set out, apply international law, and hold bad actors to account. Given that global mechanisms such as the International Criminal Court and International Court of Justice sit at the pointy end of ordering the disorder, why do you not give them more time or even credence to these institutions? And then the second comes from Jared. I realise, given the insanely fast flow of information, that this is probably old news by now, but I was curious to hear your thoughts on the International Criminal Court decision to request warrants for leaders of both Israel and Hamas. You, Jason, offhandedly mentioned it was a big mistake, but I'd like to hear your analysis on it. Is it the fact that Israel is not a member of the ICC? Beyond the influence of the US, isn't it important for other countries and international entities to isolate Netanyahu to try to influence his behaviour, since diplomacy doesn't seem to be working? What should the ICC have done with the information they gathered? Jason.
Wow. What amazing questions. And I love the fact that the mega orderers out there are poring over every word and analyzing it with a fine-tooth comb and catching me when I slipped up. So you're right, I did slip up. It's very difficult to speak in fully thought-out prose spontaneously several hours a week. My poo-pooing of the ICC and ICJ didn't make sense without further context, which I wasn't able to give given time constraints. So I know it's incumbent upon us as a pod which claims to want to order the disorder, to not talk down to those very few ordering institutions that do exist, like the UN and the ICC, ICJ, without any explanations. Of course, I feel that the UN, ICC, and ICJ have been influenced by disorderers on the left and neo-populist right, and that there are some aspects of them which don't function. So let me just lay out my concerns here. My concerns are that these bodies right now have shown that they are not at the pointy end of ordering the disorder. In other words, they've indicted Putin, and it does nothing to change the flow of the war in Ukraine. So if they indict Bibi, the indictment in a way showcases how hollow the international order is, because it doesn't change the flow of anything in Gaza. So that doesn't actually put forth a great case, as it were, for ordering. But then my concerns about indicting Bibi and Sinwar together is a little bit different. To my mind, it creates a false equivalency between a democratically elected leader, albeit a crooked and neo-populist one who has clearly committed war crimes, Bibi, And then on the other hand, a psychotic, bloodthirsty, unelected terrorist mastermind who's been in jail, right? And I don't think we should have an equivalency there. Bibi is, to me, more akin to a Trump or a George W. Bush. Both committed war crimes. It's beyond doubt. But we don't see the ICC indicting them. And you have to keep in mind that both Israel and the U.S. are not signatories to the ICC. So I think that there was something a little cheeky going on here. And I'm very concerned about the double standards, which is that the ICC doesn't indict Western democratically elected leaders, except if they happen to be Israeli. And so that double standard undoes the whole legitimacy for me. So if we had a new kind of institution that functioned and it had teeth, and it would do exactly the same to American and British and French leaders as it would to Israeli leaders, then it's okay. But just stigmatizing Israel is just going to push Israel and Israelis to say, fuck you to the international system. And then they're not going to care at all about these indictments. And they're going to say, well, what does it matter if we use white phosphorus in Lebanon or we do deliberate starving in Gaza, because the international order is so against us, we're going to be lambasted whether we do it or not. And the fact is, no one was protesting when the Saudis were killing civilians in Yemen, and no one was making warrants against W. Bush for massive killing of civilians in Iraq and Afghanistan. So I'm very concerned, Kristen, about the hypocrisy undermining international order and then the unenforceability of the ICC mandates. But thank you so much to both Jared and Kristen for their questions. And it really is going to keep me in check, which is that I shouldn't throw out flippant comments without an explanation. And we're going to come back in the fall or in the winter to the very nature of these institutions and what could be done to give them more teeth and function better.
Jason, thank you for that. I want to come in on this partly because I was the head of section for international humanitarian law. At the time, the negotiations took place to establish the International Criminal Courts on Yugoslavia and Rwanda and the International Criminal Court. And in fact, I wrote the very first policy recommendations to the British government on how we should approach the ICC.
So what you're saying is that you're the original mega orderer.
Well, at the time, the British government was opposed to the ICC. I was, for very similar reasons to why George Bush's administration was skeptical about it, that it could lead to malicious prosecutions against British soldiers or American soldiers, and could become an unpredictable instrument. But what the UK actually did was it worked very hard with the Americans to insert into it some role for the UN Security Council to have oversight of how it operated. So I've seen how this system has evolved. I agree with you. The biggest problem with the International Criminal Court is that it can't enforce its rulings. But that is not the fault of the institution. That is the fault of our international order and our international system, that big players like Russia, China, Israel, India, the US are not parties to it, and they're not willing to approach it on a consistent basis. I mean, the US has hailed ICC rulings on Putin, on Russians guilty of war crimes in Ukraine. Just last year, Biden administration officials were hailing the work of the ICC in various countries in Africa and committing to support the ICC by helping bring fugitives to the court, offering to support witness protection programs for people in the ICC cases. So the Biden administration and previous administrations have hailed the ICC when they've made rulings that they like, and then called it outrageous, as Biden described the ICC's rulings on Israel, when they don't like it. That's the hypocrisy. It's not the ICC. It's the hypocrisy of the international states. So then I'm going to come on to this issue of Israel and Hamas, which is the proximate issue, which is so contentious. I do not accept that the ICC is making a false equivalence when it issued assessments against Israel behavior and Hamas behavior. I read the indictment and it was very clear. The criticisms of Israel and the actions of Netanyahu and the defense minister were on the deliberate obstruction of aid to a beleaguered population and failure to allow humanitarian assistance. The criticisms of Hamas were about its bloodthirsty, brutal, appalling acts of terrorism and sheltering amongst civilians and putting so many civilians at risk. They were based on evidence submitted and evidence gathered by ICC experts. And I go back to Jared's question. What should the ICC do with the information they gathered? Do they ignore these evidence of war crimes? And then there's this issue of saying, oh, but it's always against Israel. In fact, by far the largest number of indictments the ICC has issued have been against countries in Africa and Africans. And it's the Africans who've become very frustrated. They think the ICC is constantly going after African leaders because that's the one area of the world where Russia and the US and other big players are fine for the ICC to do its work. But whenever it comes to look at what actions of the Russians or the Americans or their allies, that's when we all start saying it's outrageous. So I don't accept that the ICC is biased. I don't accept that there is a false equivalence between Netanyahu and Sinwar. And I do think it was absolutely correct that the ICC investigated the situation in Gaza, where it does have authority. I think the ICC is doing its job, and the failure is on the international community to back the ICC.
It is, as always, Alex, a pleasure to disagree agreeably with you and to allow the listeners to come up with their own opinions. We are going to put the unedited text of the International Criminal Court prosecutor Karim Khan's statement announcing his application for arrest warrants against the leaders of Israel and the Hamas terror group, published on May 20, 2024, in the show notes, because it's a very complicated issue, and for those who are interested, they may want to read that text themselves. I'm going to try to stump you just as the listeners have stumped me. Joseph writes, when you all talk about authoritarians and their threat to democracy, isn't it a constant reference to democratically elected leaders, i.e. Orban, Trump, Naib, and the like? The majority of global authoritarians are leftists, communists, and Islamists, or more accurately, liberal authoritarians in Muslim countries like most of North Africa. Why don't you reference those unelected authoritarians, Maduro, Ortega, Diaz-Canel, Haftar, or any of the Gulfi kings? It would be interesting to hear you all address how these authoritarians and their followers are frequent bedfellows to contribute to global disorder. Wow, Joseph, great question. I do think that we somehow talk about this, but I would love to hear your thoughts first, Alex.
My thought is, touché, fair point. It's a completely legitimate observation that we spend a lot of time on the show talking about the frustrations with kind of our own side rather than the real disorderers. So I want to make it very, very clear. I'm absolutely in no doubt that the main people throwing chaos into this world are indeed the dictators in Iran, Venezuela, North Korea, the disruptor-in-chief in the Kremlin, the authoritarian leaders in China, the brutal leaders in Myanmar, in Syria, the autocratic, corrupt governments in places like Egypt. I absolutely 100% accept the point, and I am sorry that we give any impression that we do not fully recognise them as the main disorderers and problem and illegitimate leaders. The reason, at least in my part, why we end up talking about people like Trump and Orban or Netanyahu with reference to our previous discussion is because we expect something better from democracies, and because the election of populists within the democratic world, I think, makes it harder for the international community or the West to cooperate effectively and push back and challenge the authoritarians in the countries that you mentioned. If we are not behaving and adhering to the standards we expect of others, it undermines our moral authority to challenge them. And I just give you an example of that. And I apologize because I know I'm constantly referring back to previous jobs that I did, and I'm like a stuck record, like Starmer. Did you know I'm the
I was
son
going to
of a
say,
toolmaker?
are you the son of a toolmaker?
Yeah, as the son of a toolmaker. As a former head of human rights in the British Foreign Office, first of all, I can identify with your concern. It used to drive me nuts that Amnesty International was constantly criticizing what we and the Americans did or what Israel did and what our friends were doing. And I was like, why aren't you focusing on what's going on in Zimbabwe or Myanmar or Cuba or Venezuela? And so, yes, I've experienced that frustration. It's not all us. We're the good guys trying to fix these problems. However, I was head of that department right at the time of Guantanamo Bay and the waterboarding scandals and the torture memos and the scandals over extradition and our treatment of detainees. And it did just make it harder to speak with authority and legitimacy when we were trying to have human rights dialogues with the Russians or the Chinese or the Iranians, because they would just say, well, what about Guantanamo? Or what about waterboarding? And of course, I think it's apples and oranges, a bit like Jason thinks the issues with Netanyahu and Hamas are different. And by the way, I do agree, they are different. There are still issues, but they are, of course, of a different qualitative nature. And I would say, yes, but in our countries, we debate these issues. Our press are allowed to report on them. We don't throw our reporters in prison for exposing these kind of atrocities. These are apples and oranges, but it did make it harder. So my frustration and why I certainly talk a lot about dysfunction in our own societies is I feel that dysfunction undermines our ability to push back on these disorderers. That's my perspective.
Again, wow, great question. Thank you, Joseph. Love the mega orderers out there. So fun for us to kind of understand how you think. I want to defend our legacy a bit and say that Alex and I do reference the disordering implications of when the Emiratis and Qataris engage in proxy wars in places like Sudan and Libya. We do call out Putin and other autocrats. But I think a lot of what we're talking about when it comes to ordering the disorder is how can we in the democratic world work together better with peer countries? And therefore, we're particularly concerned about neopopulisms in former democratic systems. So Meloni and Modi and Orban are a more important comparison or challenge for us in the Anglosphere than the things that a Saudi monarch does to his opposition or than a Zimbabwean tyrant does by starving his population. Because as bad as things get, the U.S. isn't going to become Zimbabwe, but we easily might be heading towards becoming a version of Hungary or Italian neopopulism. So I would say that that's why we focus on it. And I would like to spin this back at you, dear listener. What do you see that's been coming down the pipeline with Meloni, AfD, Marine Le Pen, Farage, that you think Starmer and Macron have missed. I think that they've missed a ton of things, but please write us with what you think the messaging that the orderers should be doing to combat these disorderers should be, because I guess this connects to what Alex and I have talked about in other episodes about Starmer and others, is that maybe they're not willing to get on the front foot to say these messages, to cut off the appeal of, for lack of a better term, disordering, pro-tariff, anti-migrant economics. After the break, we're going to take some more listeners' questions. Mega Orderers, wanted to tell you guys about another podcast that I really like, The Jordan Harbinger Show. We're really fortunate to have Jordan as a guest later this year. He is a superstar. His show features in-depth interviews with some of the world's most fascinating minds. And what Jordan brings to the pod is a cool, calm Californian energy, talking about tech regulation, but then also relationships and some self-help advice. He also speaks with some of the most fascinating minds out there, like Jamie Metzel and Bill Browder. It's really a must-listen for any of you mega orderers out there. Search for The Jordan Harbinger Show on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Let's move on to Joachim. He writes, Dear Alex, just some hopefully brief thoughts about something you said about continuing the war in Ukraine as the lesser evil compared to letting Putin have his will and thereby set a fatal precedent for other authoritarian rulers around the world. One of them, of course, being China's. And Joachim was not actually brief. It has 3 points. I'm going to be very fast. 1, Putin is operating under a different assumption than people think. He wants to have Ukraine as a colony. And he is channeling the way Russians look at Eastern Ukraine from the period of Catherine the Great until the present as being a part of Russia. And we have to remember that 11 million Ukrainians and Russians are related, which means that almost 1/4 of Ukrainians have relatives in Russia. 2, and now reading exactly from what he has said, I am very sure that it is an illusion of the highest order to think Russia would ever stop this war, even if all the Ukrainian territories were quote unquote freed. I think the opposite is true. A compromise, as painful as it would be, might be a way out, a way to save face for both sides, a basis for a more sane future, while a defeat of one side would only postpone the conflict to a future point in time. 3, I think it is time to finally accept, if never approve, that there are many players, among them very rich and powerful ones like China and Saudi Arabia, who have a vital interest in Russia not being defeated and sanctions not working. For like you, only seen from their perspective, they do not want to see a precedent being set. Maybe you could use your show to frame such a compromise more positively to the wider public. Before I toss it over to you, Alex, I'm going to say that I read exactly the question in the words that it was given, although I don't fully grasp what they mean.
There was a lot more in the email from Joachim, and I really appreciate you taking the time to come in with these carefully thought through thoughts. However, I can't frame your proposed compromise positively. So I certainly do understand the yearning to find a way to end the horrible killing and end the suffering and end the war. And of course, I also understand the yearning implicit behind your commentary not to end up where each side escalates and gradually more weapons are sent in, we all get more closely drawn into it, we up our support for Ukraine, Russia ups its support and does deals with countries like North Korea to get more weapons, and gradually we escalate and we're all terrified of World War III actually happening. But I cannot accept the premise of your question. and I hate to draw the historical analogy, but to say ending the war is the lesser evil comparing to letting Putin have his will. I mean, that was absolutely the mistake that was made on the eve of World War II, of thinking we can just appease Hitler by letting him grab the Sudetenland and that he would just end there. And that was, of course, a mistake. It didn't end that way. Secondly, I absolutely cannot accept the premise that because Russians, or some Russians, and Putin has fueled this narrative that they have some historical right to treat Ukraine as a colony, gives them a legitimate right actually to occupy it as a colony. When the Soviet Union broke up, Russia signed a treaty recognizing Ukrainian independence, just as the Brits recognized Indian independence. And the fact that there are still millions of British nationals who have relationship and family connections to India doesn't give us any right to treat India as a colony now, and Russia has no right to regard Ukraine as a colony. And it's even more dangerous to premise it on the notion that because there are people who were originally of Russian origin living in Ukraine, that gives Russia an entitlement, because that is precisely the argument that Russia and Putin has tried to propel, and that allows them to claim that they might have a historic right to reoccupy Estonia, where there is a native Russian population, or Georgia, where a heck of a lot of Russians have now moved to live inside Georgia. And they have used that argument to say we are protecting Russian nationals to advance a very aggressive foreign policy. The third reason I think it's absolutely unconscionable is implicit, and it was more implicit in your full email, is that we somehow, the great powers, should do a deal with Russia to end the war over the heads of the Ukrainians themselves. It is denying the Ukrainians agency in their own fate, and they have a right to their own sovereignty, their own independence. And Russia explicitly signed documents, including as part of the Budapest Memorandum, when Ukraine gave up its nuclear weapons, recognizing Ukrainian territorial integrity and recognizing explicitly they had a right to make their own sovereign foreign policy and security decisions. That includes the principle of being allowed to apply for membership of NATO and the EU if they wanted it. Fourth, it is not true that NATO and the EU aggressively pushed Ukrainian membership and Putin was forced to respond. In fact, NATO and the EU, until the moment of Russia's invasion, did everything they could to try and slow roll Ukrainian membership. The majority of members of NATO and the EU never wanted to let Ukraine in. And it is only as a result of Russia's own aggressive actions against Ukraine and Georgia and other countries in the region that has forced countries like them desperately to seek membership of the NATO to guarantee their security, and that NATO has been forced, rather against its will, to give it more consideration than they really want. It is Russia's own actions that are driving Ukraine towards NATO. And finally, I don't accept the premise that if we allow Russia to effectively get away with its military aggression and reward it by awarding a chunk, 4 provinces of Ukraine, to become Russian, that somehow that will encourage countries like China to back off its claims like Taiwan.
It'll have the opposite effect.
It will have absolutely the opposite effect. And we have to give agency to countries like Taiwan and Ukraine that they may see the situation more accurately than we do. My very last point, the only scenario in which I feel a horrible, painful end to the war where Ukraine is forced to give up some territories, which I do not believe will be the end of it. I feel it will be a very unstable peace, is if we in the West betray the Ukrainians, talk the talk of saying we back them, and then don't actually give them the weapons to win, which would be a catastrophic betrayal and a catastrophic indication of Western weakness and perfidy, as was the case when we withdrew from Afghanistan and allowed the Taliban back in. And I feel it would encourage and embolden dictators around the world. So Joachim, I understand the sentiment behind your question of longing for the war to end, the suffering to end. There was nothing in your email that implied any endorsement of Russian actions or any reflection of Putin talking points. I want our listeners to be very clear that you are very clear in your condemnation of Russian actions in your longer email, and you are motivated by a desire to end the killing. But I don't think negotiating some kind of ignoble peace over the heads of the Ukrainians will achieve. And I'm really sorry, because I want this war to end as much as you do, and I'm not a warmonger. But sometimes you have to stand up for your values and principles, and this is one of those issues. Here endeth the lesson. Definitely enough from me. Jason.
That was definitely enough from you, but allow me to say, you may preach on, preacher, because on this issue we could not agree more agreeably. And I think it is critical to draw a line here under wrong thinking. I think that Joachim's heart is in the right place, and it is a seemingly reasonable question. Can't we all just get along? And don't the Russians have interests in Ukraine? And blah, blah, blah. And many of the people who are attracted by the light, oh, but didn't we in the West provoke the bear? As soon as you become a geopolitics expert, professional, uber nerd, whatever you want to label it, you have to make choices. And one of them is to not compromise with people who want you dead. Putin wants us dead, and the world that we stand for, the democratic world of orderers and compromises, he wants us all to lose. We can't compromise with him. It's like tolerating someone who is unbelievably intolerant. So as much as it sucks, we have to fight and win, because the worldview that he wants is not only antithetical to the worldview where Ukrainians get to live in their houses and raise their own children and teach them freedom and have them speak the language that they want them to speak, their own children. It's antithetical to the worldview that we believe in, where you get to vote and you get sovereignty and you get, freedom of religion and freedom of property rights and everything that we might want to believe in. If we allow a compromise, because this is a compromise where one guy has a spear to your throat and you say, oh, I compromise. Do you know what I mean? That's a world of might just making right. And I would like to direct Joachim to two amazing episodes that we've done. Personally, my two favorite episodes that we've done on the pod are actually about this. And that's with Bill Browder and with Evgenia Karamurza. And if you need to be convinced as to why we can't just compromise with Putin, well, these are people whose life stories are far more compelling than mine, and the insights that they derive from it are going to be crystal clear. So with that moral clarity out there, I'm going to say that is more than enough from me.
Definitely, but that was really good, Jason. So that is definitely enough from me. Thank you so much, everybody, for listening. And we really appreciate the questions. We do try to give them real justice. So that's it for this week. If you too want to help order the disorder, please tap follow right now and you'll be notified when every episode launches.
And we're on social media too. Just search Disorder Show and please subscribe to our Substack in the show notes. Our producer is, as always, the one, the only, the George McDonagh. And our executive producer is Neil Fearn.
I like that. The George McDonagh. Thank you for listening, and I hope you have an orderly week from the Disorder Podcast.